Hello, Dr. James Johnson, historian. I want to discuss with you part two of my conversation about the coronavirus we are experiencing now as a pandemic and the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, as well as the 1793 yellow fever epidemic. And I'm looking at those from a Philadelphia based perspective. Of course, let me define the difference between an epidemic and a pandemic. An epidemic is an outbreak of disease within an active outbreak of disease within a given community, neighborhood, or city or region. This is what the yellow fever situation exhibited when the disease was centered in Philadelphia, but it impacted the suburbs as well as Camden, New Jersey, um, and those kind of the Philadelphia metropolitan area in general was the hotbed, with Philadelphia being the roaring epicenter. It was an epidemic. In 1918, however, we had 30 to 50 million people die. 1793, Philadelphia, there was roughly 5,000 people that died. 10% of the population died in Philadelphia in 1793 from yellow fever. The 1918 numbers dwarfed any pandemic yet to be seen. Within 3 months, during the course of that run of that disease, between 30 and 50 million people died globally. In Philadelphia, as a center of examining the situation, on October the 10th alone, we had 759 recorded deaths associated with the Spanish flu, the highest number ever recorded since it has not been exceeded yet. So, what are we looking at otherwise? I'm a social historian. I look at what's going on with people. Okay, in particular, I'm associated with looking at the events as they involve African Americans. That's my specialty. That's my specialty. So when I look at 1793, 1918, and 2020, the similarities are we have national leadership that is unfriendly to African Americans. George Washington, first vice president, of course, slaveholder. In 1918, in the White House, we had Woodrow Wilson, a racist who resegregated the civil service system when he obtained office. That's one of his most famous, or I should say, infamous acts relative to race relations. And now we have, of course, White House leadership that is famously difficult in terms of it's famously difficult in fashioning a meaningful relationship with African American people. That is something that is now being exacerbated by circumstances that we witnessed in 1918, and that is a violent activity against African Americans. In 1918, well, let's look at that general area. In 1917, we experienced the East St. Louis massacre, in which 35 African Americans were murdered over a couple days when white mobs in the same neighborhood that Jerome Brown was murdered in St. Louis, that same region, that hotbed. In fact, there's a book that is out now that I'll talk about that later. It looks at St. Louis as being a hotbed of American history as it relates to the violence against African Americans. Of course, today we are reeling from the murder uh, that we witnessed of George Floyd, and it operates as another vector, another example of the devaluation of black life. And I can tell you that this is taking place as we see in police relationships uh, in the midst of this pandemic. We are seeing in other areas that the same mentality is operating, so that you have, for example, in southern New Jersey, you have a virulent white supremacist foothold in the department, in the in education. You have a virulent white supremacist foothold in education, reflected in the teacher education programs in South Jersey. There will be more of that later, but that is something that we find now, and 102 years ago we find this virulent kind of anti-black activity taking place with a national leadership that is also simultaneously unfriendly with black people. This is what took place in 1918. 1918 in July. Now, look, the epidemic in 1918 takes place, starts off like early September, following a march, a patriotic march called the Liberty March, that was designed to raise money to fund the war effort. It's patriotic events that were taking place around the country, these liberty marches. And kids would throw in their nickels and pennies, and we would have the bands marching, and the kind of community support, flag waving activity, all designed to generate a national spirit of togetherness for the war effort. Well, September, early September, Philadelphia has this parade against the advice of health officials, because there had been evidence of the disease appearing in the records. So against the advice of medical authorities, the parade was held, and after that there was an explosion of a disease that just began to wipe out folks, wipe out its victims at record numbers, breakneck speeds, similar to 1793, when the death rate was so high that carters, that is, folks who would move goods by wagon, were hired. In fact, they had African American carters. As I discussed, you can look at part one to see that conversation about how African Americans were put forward as the not put forward, but who came forward as the first responders in that disease, and died at the same rate that the people they were helping were dying at. 10% of the African American population died in Philadelphia in 1793, just like the white population. Different in 1918. the disease seemingly went over the doors of many African Americans. Not all, because thousands, tens of thousands perished, but they perished at a proportionally lower number than white victims. They also, and white victims themselves, among them, it was the population of immigrants, white immigrants, who died at the highest rate of Spanish flu. You see, but African Americans significantly were affected the least, which was very odd. In fact, it precipitated a whole divine inspiration perspective among African Americans that this was something God had delivered in retribution for the 1917 massacre in East St. Louis, in retribution for the ongoing violence against African Americans in July 1918 in Philadelphia. If you look at the newspapers of the period, you'll see 5,000 unprecedented mob of 5,000 people attacking black families in South Philadelphia, and the outrage that of spills across the country against that is represented in newspapers across the country. You'll see this attention to this Philadelphia situation of white racism operating, and we see similar situations today. Something different today, however, compared to 1918, with all the anti-black violence. And gee, look, we had just as the epidemic is unfolding, a number of black soldiers are hung in Houston. A dozen black soldiers are hung, mass hanging of black soldiers who were defending themselves against the Texas-style kind of racism that they experienced down there at Fort Houston. And so now with this situation, we're watching the president, of course, today calling protesters thugs. However, in Charlottesville, there was good people on both sides. But here, there's good people on one side, the side of the police. The protesters are thugs. And so that's something that harkens back to 1918 as a kind of attitude that we're watching from important officials relative to the circumstances domestically that operate as an ancillary, as a connective kind of event next to the disease itself. So, for example, we have in 2020 a urgent rush by business oriented folks to get back, and the White House itself is, and again, the White House itself, to get people back into the business of regenerating the economy. However, the idea of the disease being such that we are ignorant of it to the extent that we know we need to continue social distancing is overlooked. And so that is a comparison. We're looking at the medical community in 2020 versus the medical community in 1918. In 1918, the medical community united around its protocols for containing the disease, its protocols for treating the victims, and its protocols for maintaining, creating a safety zones, quarantine kinds of specifications were put together. And you did not have a resistance against this from the White House. But now we have a divide between the White House and the medical community. In 1918, of course, the White House was kind of ignoring a lot of the things because they had a war. You could make the argument that national leadership in 1918 had a valid kind of rationale for suppressing the extent of the disease. This, in fact, is why we call the Spanish flu, because most of the Western governments involved in World War One, and I noted this in part one, I'll just do this a minute. The Western governments in 1918 involved in the war had a need to keep their troops and their home populations enthusiastic about the supporting the war, and so they suppressed the point of the war being a cause of the disease. That is, the movement of people in trenches, being in trenches, and those kinds of things, and being in close quarters and military bases, close quarters in the field, close quarters in the cities where they were being shipped out from. All of those close quarterness spilling over into the civilian population, so everybody is like, no one is quarantining, no social distancing taking place, of course, and so this is what we wound up with. So Spain, however, being neutral in World War One, had no real need to suppress any news. They had no domestic population to generate support from, and they had no troops to keep enthused and more and from being demoralized. So their journalists were freely writing about the disease, and as they freely wrote about this disease, it became associated as being the source of the disease, and that's how we get the name Spanish flu. This is what scholars who have examined the situation have concluded. So that's why we get the name Spanish flu. It's actually the H1N1 virus that was discovered not until 1933. So that is something that I want to point out. Now, the 2020 situation here, we have medical advancement unprecedented. We have at molecular levels of knowledge of things, and I doubt if it will take as long as it took to obtain the vaccines for corona as it did for the Spanish flu and the yellow fever as well. The yellow fever, as I discussed in part one, was the vaccine for that was confirmed in 1912 by Walter Reed down in Panama. Well, actually, 1902, I think he makes that discovery. 1902, he confirms the work of a Cuban biologist who, in 1888, his name was Finley, had discovered and made some had given several lectures on the movement of the Aedes aegypti mosquito, which identifying that as the source of the yellow fever disease, and so on and so forth. So um, you get that in 1793, 1918. You get that vaccine discovered. But the current situation, none of us anticipated taking those numbers of years. Given the kinds of medical and scientific technology at our disposal now. So that is one hope that we certainly hold on to, that this will soon be dealt with in that regard. So, uh, so that was in the medical situations. Now, the circumstance of looking at coronavirus versus Spanish flu in terms of a Philadelphia connection itself, I think we have to consider looking at Philadelphia as being Philadelphia again sets itself up as being a very good place to have a conversation, to examine, to understand how these things operate in urban cities. Okay, Philadelphia, we the largest big city in America. That is the largest. It's the largest big poor city in America. The level of unemployment, the level of poverty is something that is available in all of the numbers. We can look at the dismal numbers. And certainly, this is not to take away from the peripheral kind of poverty that we see in Chester and Wilmington, Camden, those various satellite cities around Philadelphia. But again, the epicenter being Philadelphia, we can look at the situation in 1918 versus the situation in 2020. In 1918, the city government operated in ways that support the kind of policies that we're currently seeing. City officials really were doing the best that they could based on the kind of things that they were faced with. My goodness, we're talking about 759 people dying in one day. That is the kind of thing you can't imagine. Where are their bodies going to be stored? They were using all kinds of facilities, ice houses, refrigerators in industrial settings became the kind of situation where people's relatives and loved ones had to be stored until they could be buried. When we look at Chalfant Monroe's family, Chalfant was taken home to Chambersburg. His family lived in 24th and York Street in North Philadelphia, and he was a student at, I think it was the Cleghorn Elementary School, which was in that somewhere around 17th and 17th and Susquehanna, in that area at Cleghorn Elementary School. I'll get clear on that exact location for you. But Chalfant, as a 10-year-old, had just enrolled in the school system because his family had just moved had just moved to Philadelphia from Pittsburgh. The family began together. Chalfant was born in Chambersburg, and then the family relocated out to Pittsburgh, and then they left Pittsburgh, where they had family, and they came to Philadelphia. In fact, when they made that kind of transition, Chambersburg to Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh to Philadelphia. They were traveling along what is generally known as Lincoln Highway, the original name, one of the early names for the current Route 76, International Route 76. And this is the same um, route paralleled by the rail system that permitted the uh, spread of the disease in 1918 because troops were coming on the trains and they were coming in convoys over the highways out of the Midwest. Um, the civilian population up and down the highway taking that disease, it facilitated the spread of the disease. Now, again, socially, I'm a social historian. I want to just to say that when I looked at the family of John Monroe and Emma Monroe and Chalfant, one of the things that um, evolved out of that examination was to discover the history of Chalfant's mother. His maternal history was so rich that um, it kind of it's a reward for what they suffered. The creation of their historical record in a narrative sense is a reward in you uh, from um, the well it's I should say that's a poor metaphor, but it is certainly a benefit. It is a historical benefit that derives from examining who these people are. So when we look at the maternal history, we find that Emma Norris's family were part of that whole population that in 1863, when the Confederates invaded Pennsylvania and invaded Chambersburg, they were part of the population that had to flee the city. They were there that early. And so her grandfather, James Punch, and his wife, Nancy, they are the grandparents of Emma Norris's grandparents. James Punch was considered one of the first African Americans to live in Chambersburg. That's her on her mother's side. On her father's side, we find that her paternal grandfather had come down from, they were like from Hagerstown, Maryland area, had in fact gained his freedom in enslavement and had and purchased his grandmother. You're finding all of this. He's purchased his grandmother. Excuse me. He purchased Norris's Emma Norris Monroe's grandmother. He purchased his two children. So, and that's a story in and of itself. The story of her the paternal side of her family. And so that is the Norris side of her family. So she had the Punch side, which the Punch family, which is Emma Norris's mother's line, and the Norris family, which is Emma Norris's father's line. Both of those very rich in terms of discovering the history of black central Pennsylvanians. And from a non-Malthusian perspective, that is, you know, Malthus was a social scientist who argued that natural calamities such as earthquakes and hurricanes, which cause a lot of disruption and death and those kinds of things, are beneficial to society because they allow replenishment, they allow a kind of getting rid of some excess whatever it's a refreshment as the Malthusian perspective of calamities, natural calamities, argues. You know, Richard Malthus is the philosopher. Anyway, I'm not coming from that perspective where you know all of these things are beneficial to society. I'm making a point that we find as a bomb almost the creation of the knowledge. So if a historian comes in and from that we can create something meaningful, that is certainly something that is to be appreciated. And so those are the kinds of things I think that we look for um, with the 2020 coronavirus as well. What can we learn about ourselves um, in the midst of this that helps us to be beneficial? Well, some things we do know about ourselves. We're still a deeply racist country. Compared to 1918, uh, I think we have fewer racist uh, white people in America. We can see that with the demonstrations now going on in Minneapolis. Half the people in Minneapolis that I saw in the news, well, not half, but a significant number are white protesters who clearly are upset at what they have seen. We didn't have those kinds of we didn't have that kind of white support in 1918 as we witnessed black soldiers being hung and black people being killed in the street. So we have made some progress, even though it doesn't seem like it when you get that national leadership that is just like pushing a kind of like antisocial rhetoric so forcefully. And that's unfortunate. But um, even though we're seeing that, I think we need to see through that and understand that that this is behavior is being rejected across racial lines. And so, although although our national leader now has a kind of large following among folks who really have no economic basis for associating themselves with this billionaire. You know, only thing that they have is a psychological platform of racial animosity that motivates them in many respects, and connecting that up with being anti-Chinese and anti-black and anti-Mexican and anti everybody else in the world and USA number one, rather than seeing us as a world community with some um, interest that means we should take leadership in fashioning what needs to happen post corona, and in ways that allow all affected populations to emerge better than we are. We can do this. And when I next write about this, I will certainly extend this conversation to what we're going to be looking at the end of this um, pandemic that has essentially rearranged how we see ourselves and rearranged how we will do things going forward. Thank you very much. Please, you may email me at weusi7@aol.com. And this is concludes part 2 of my discussion of the Spanish flu pandemic relative to today. Thank you very much, and I hope this has been beneficial. Stay strong, Stay safe. We will get through this together.